So a huge thank you to everybody who is joining us today for attending this webinar hosted by Stop Ecocide Toronto and Stop Ecocide Canada. So I'll introduce myself very quickly. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I founded and directed the Stop Ecocide Toronto team, and I work for the Stop Ecocide Canada team. Um, I'd like to start before introducing our four incredible speakers for today by acknowledging the land from which I am joining. So the land that I am currently on is known as Toronto, but it is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. But taking a step back from these words, I acknowledge that what we are going to be discussing today, in land defense, environmental issues, are fundamentally interconnected with land acknowledgements and continuing legacies of colonialism. So I encourage everybody to reflect on the land that they are joining from, which Indigenous peoples have used the land traditionally. And if you are comfortable doing so, send it in the chat, the lands that you are zooming in from today. While people do this, I will introduce our wonderful moderator for the webinar today, Katie Sharma. So Katie is a reporter with Inside Climate News, focusing on international environmental law and justice. Before joining Inside Climate News, she practiced law, specializing in commercial litigation. She's written publications that have been published by the Washington Post, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, and many other acclaimed publications. So we're so grateful to have her here with us today. And with that, I will pass it over to Katie.
Thank you, Emily, and good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Stop Ecocide for involving me. And before we get started, I wanted to remind all of you in the audience that you can submit questions in the Q&A box. And at the end of each panelist, or at the end of the panelist discussion, we'll have a chance to address some of those. So I want to get right into it. And I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Chief Dana Tizya-Tramm, the Vuntut Gwitchin Chief. And he is based out of Old Crow, which is 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Chief Tizya-Tramm is the youngest chief in his nation's history, and he is a climate and youth advocate. Chief Tizya-Tramm, you have the floor.
Trinplan Gwinzi, Masi Cho Shalaknai, Ke Wadak, Billy Nakwa. Good afternoon, all of my relations, for you are all of our relations to one another. My name is Dana Tizya-Tramm, and I've just invited creation and creator into our space today. So would you like me to just go through introductions now and then our talk a bit later? Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Well, that works. So next up, our next speaker tonight will be Jojo Mata. Jojo Mata is the co-founder of Stop Ecocide. She and her team there are advocating to make widespread and long-term environmental destruction an international crime. Their campaign is principally aimed at making ecocide the fifth crime before the International Criminal Court. Over to you, Jojo, if you'd like to say hello.
Just a very quick hello from me, and very much looking forward to this discussion. Thanks very much, Katie.
Our third speaker tonight is going to be Aishwarya Pater. She has worked on international campaigns to stop fossil fuel projects and advocates for improvements to climate education and social justice. Aishwarya, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. As Katie mentioned, my name is Aishwarya. I'm 16 years old, and I go by she, they pronouns. Very grateful to be here.
And I'll introduce our last panelist tonight, Lisa Oldring. Lisa is a human rights lawyer who has close to 20 years of experience advising the UN's Human Rights Office. Today, her practice focuses on climate accountability, and she'll be talking about ecocide from a legal and human rights perspective.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I wish Katie hadn't mentioned how many years I've been working, because next to Aishwarya, you can figure out how old I am. It's a real pleasure to share the space with everyone on this panel. And I'm speaking to you, joining you from Treaty 7 territory here in the Rocky Mountains, which are traditional lands of the Stoney Nakoda, the Blackfoot, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, well, Chief Tizya-Tramm, do you want to kick us off? And yeah, I'll pass the mic over to you.
Masi Cho, very much appreciate this opportunity and to share this space and speak with all of you today. A big must-see to Ecocide, Toronto and International, as well as the fellow panelists that join me today. A big shout out to all of those listening here as well. I saw a lot of the land acknowledgements and luckily have been to many of those places. Love Bowen Island, by the way, very beautiful. But if we can just take a moment as I share a part of myself, a part of my experience and my heart and my mind with everyone, to really invite everyone into the moment and really occupying our minds, our hearts, our bodies, the bodies of our community and the bodies of our nation. All of our time, we cannot make the mistake of falling into fallacies of chasing, measuring our lives and each other against our bank accounts, our job titles, and our vehicles and the rest. Our lives are sacred opportunities as we are humans having a spiritual experience, not necessarily the other way around, of humans that have a spiritual experience. And I so much appreciate having the ability in channeling and sharing the teachings of my peoples as well, that when we speak of creator, it doesn't necessarily mean any one specific God, but creation in general. And it is an ability for us to feel the sacred nature of this moment, that perhaps we are creator's prayer, instead of just feeling those moments in a prayer, but expanding them into our being. And Indigenous peoples are bringing into the forefront through today, as we've been culturally, legally, and in every way suppressed, is I find what has really delivered us to this issue today, and much of what all of our work has been up against, is the colonial or modern culture today definitely knows, and it definitely does, but indigeneity is about knowing, being, and doing. So I think a large part of our work, breathing being into our systems, to our economies, to our legislation, this is a big part of recognizing the human experience. So all of this to say is that I recognize you, share this experience with you, and am very happy and honored to share some of my experiences. That of being of which I was saved by my culture. A lot of people are kind of surprised to know that I was homeless at 13, a drug addict, very much in the throes of violence. I've been stabbed a number of times. And so that's basically a bit of a background in getting lost into things, but I slowly started coming out of that. But what really saved me was really actually understanding the nature of our culture, because before I was a tumbleweed. I wasn't connected to anything, and I was blown around by the contemporary winds of fashions, economies, these types of things, chasing glittering prizes, if you will. But when I had learned the stories of my family, my ancestors, which I'd always kind of known, but once I started to embody them, I realized that I was just a bud on an ancient twig, on a prehistoric branch, a part of a tree that's roots went deep into the earth. So through our oral histories, traditions, now that I've made this connection, my ancestors are now able to live through me, and I carry them. So the voice that I speak to you with is not my own, but it is the voice that was carried by my people that I share with you today, but is the birthright of my daughter and of my grandchildren. So you can see how this Indigenous interchronological community and societal technology of oral history has allowed me to take a lot of today's stresses off of me, and it can be carried for me to allow me to do this work today. And the spaces it has allowed me, I very quickly, after getting through and finding myself, I quickly found myself coming into leadership within the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, a self-governing First Nation. There are about 27 First Nations that are getting out of the treaties through land claims and modern treaty or modern government agreements. And what a lot of Canadians should know is that Indigenous peoples, as we heard in the last leadership race, were not a political election winner. At 5% the population in Canada, yet we have pre-existing legal rights. And this framework in Canada, the 150-year mark for Canada was, like Canada's Standing Rock or these major movements, because I think a lot of Canadians looked inwards about what this meant. What does this relationship mean with Indigenous peoples? And I see we're at the precipice of a lot of change here, and I will get into some of how that played out for me on the front lines. But what I think it's very appropriate to address is that when we look at what climate change is now forcing us to see, and we should be seeing ourselves in it, because it wasn't the Industrial Revolution and the amalgamation of steel, steam, and rubber that gave our species the exponential ability to emit greenhouse gases. That was the issue. It was our intent. When we approached the earth and the animals and each other as a commodity, something that was to be dominated, that is where climate change began. And now that we've approached the world with an imbalanced worldview, now the world has become imbalanced. So we should really see ourselves in this change, and our systems also to be held accountable. But they're only tools. And we have to remember who we are and why we created and wielded these tools. Because if not, these tools will wield us. It was not man that domesticated wheat in the Fertile Crescent. It was wheat that domesticated man. So we have to understand these relationships and our identity and our intentions. And Indigenous peoples have this in droves. So Indigenous principles, that of renewability, reconciliation, that of balance, these are the principles of solutions to climate change. So Indigenous peoples who were held back around the world from sharing our cultures, because as Jared Diamond writes in Guns, Germs, and Steel, Indigenous peoples were oppressed around the world, not because we were a threat physically to any of their systems, but mentally. What we believed in balance disrupted and went against the writings of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, this consumption for consumption's sake, and renewability and balance weren't very profitable, but it's the task now that we've all inherited. So some of the on-the-ground implications is I quickly found myself doing a lot of work regarding the Peel watershed. And I really recommend people to Google the Peel watershed in our advocacy, bringing the land use planning all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2017, where Canada ruled in the favor of 3 First Nations: the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, the Trondeck Gwitchin First Nation, and the Nacho-Nyack Dun First Nation. See, land use planning was thought of actually by my father during the negotiations in the 80s in the Yukon. And you have to remember, the Yukon at that time, during negotiations with First Nations, our mayor at that time was saying things like, you can't give First Nations all that money. They're like children. They wouldn't know what to do with it. And we had Danny Lang actually became a senator saying at those negotiation tables that Indigenous people should be treated just like any other immigrant. So these were the times, those times openly, what we faced as First Nations. And my father, actually a first-generation Canadian from Germany, looked at the landscape of this racism. And after coming through World War II, he knew that Indigenous peoples would need a legal mechanism to create a form of certainty for them in Crown lands or outside of our Category A and B lands, which are certain legal stratas in land sovereignty for First Nations. So this land use planning, which we brought the Yukon and Canadian government to in 2017, was protected by the Supreme Court of Canada. And now today, many Canadians don't know, there are 64,000 square kilometers of pristine lands protected, the second largest contiguous boundary protected landmass in the world, only second to Antarctica. And this was done by a group of Indigenous peoples. Our rights and supporting Indigenous rights and land rights are supporting your grandchildren's rights and all of our rights as Canadians. These lands are now going to serve to assist the flora and fauna through the changing climates. And this is really where I began a lot of my leadership. And I got to see the larger mechanisms of the inner workings of federal, territorial, and First Nation governments. But it didn't stop there. In fact, while we were coming to a close at the Supreme Court, as I faced the East, right behind me to the West in Alaska, the Trump administration got in and Trump passed the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which actually mandated for the first time in US history, the development of oil and gas in a wildlife refuge. It was actually legally, they had to drill. And this happened to be in the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd, the largest land animal migration left on Earth. The land species of Batsai caribou that allowed my people to thrive in the Arctic for tens of thousands of years. The caribou species that had been in this area for about 1.9 million years came under major threat from the Trump administration. And so for a First Nation, a village of 250 people, the entire Gwitchin Nation having about 9,000 people in it, we took the American government on. And I'm now happy to say, after much work with representatives of the House and the Senate in the United States, we have now convinced and worked with every major bank in North America, from Goldman Sachs to Royal Bank, now has enshrined in their policy that they will not support development in the wildlife refuge. So I'm just getting goosebumps now. It's such a wonderful part of all of this, but these are just the beginnings, and more of the story digs into the on the ground and how we were able to achieve these things. But if I may, when we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's many successive reports, they bear no shroud about it by saying that every sphere of our society requires a paradigm shift to remain under the 1.5 degrees. So if every single sphere of our society, such as the legal society, monetary society, all these different spheres, our industrial, our political, if they all need revolutions, then we need to look inside as individuals and what do we need to revolutionize in the principles that we carry. And that's a very big task, because so many of the things that we have inherited as modern day people, you did not develop yourself. You see, I have the juxtaposition of walking between two worlds, one foot in a prehistoric Indigenous community and peoples with an oral history that was well in development and swing before even the first written word or cuneiform of man. But while the Mesoamericans were rising up, or the Sumerians, my people had already well established their place in the Arctic North. So we've developed away from the regular trajectory of mechanized philosophies and contemporary perceptions and concepts today. So I have this ability to look between both of them and take the best of both worlds and bring them together. And I'm telling you, this is what Indigenous peoples have always waited for. Since the beginning of Canada and the Great Wampum Belt of the 18th century, which shows two canoe paths, in my opinion, is the first legal founding document of Canada, not the British North America Act. We've always wanted to affect the culture, but we were only given courtrooms and negotiation tables, which insulated us from the culture, reservation systems taking us away from communities and people. The indigenous peoples remember the principles, what I call now societal technologies that brought communities together, that brought out the inner identity of someone and wove them into our communities, empowering all of us, which empowered the land. Indigenous peoples all around the world are still carrying these lessons. So if we want to get far ahead as a modern society, we need indigenous peoples at your legislative tables, at your economic tables, because we're the closest that people who do not live on the land will get to hearing directly from the land. I call it the language before words, because the plants and the animals are always talking. And it's not some kind of Disney movie. They're telling you about the environment. They're telling you about what's happening. And us being out on there, our lives framed by our traditional knowledge, which allows us to discern the principles and lessons from our daily experiences from being out on the land, that only galvanize us in our indigenous cultures, which again is an intergenerational technology that banks on the strongest parts of what it means to be a human, which is community, which is purpose, accomplishment, belonging, respect. This is what empowers us as individuals. But even though that may be missing in modern day society, for instance, the only real ceremony in modern society is graduation, where people wear these funny hats and they throw them up in the air. Ceremony is very important in a societal technology in recognizing you listening, your power, your heart, what you have to offer, you and your community, because we can't afford to lose you. So what we're experiencing now today in my territory, 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle, in the Yukon, 60 miles east of the Alaska border, as the most northwest settlement in Canada, I can tell you unequivocally that anything that we can experience, touch, taste, feel, or hear is changing. And let me share some of those experiences with you. And this is happening now as we speak. Last winter, I went out and traveled over an hour north and south from my village, about 54,000 square kilometers of our traditional territory. There's one village with 250 people. You could fit 163 Singapores into our traditional territory. It's almost the size of France, and there's only 250 people living there. So there was absolutely no snow. And I mean less than 2 inches of snow. Now, what does that mean for the owls, the snow fox, the rodents that run through them? A stark contrast like that has cumulative, exponential, and effects throughout the whole chain in this wonderful symphony that's nature. And it changes the tuning. And so all of the instruments are off, and we will see these effects for years to come. Over the course of this summer that had just passed, our river was bone dry at less than 50% the capacity. And something I'm hearing from my elders, who were taught from their elders and their elders before them, the one thing I'm hearing, moreover, is I've never seen this before. I'm hearing that all the time. We have bluffs that are letting go and including rivers because the permafrost is melting. We have entire rivers that are draining out into the rivers. This just last spring, all of the geese came before the black ducks. We'd never seen that before. And I think one that really breaks my heart was an elder from the Gwitchin Nation up in Northeast Alaska, Trimble Gilbert, one of our elders, said that he spent the summer out on the land. And he said that the birds no longer sing to the Gwitchin people. Well, this is backed up by some of the largest bird studies recently done in the past number of years. A study on bird studies, the New York Times wrote a great article about it. Anyways, they're showing a 60% loss in bird species across North America. We're seeing this up in our area as well. We're seeing the waters change, the lands are changing, the bug populations are changing, migrations are moving, and we're also seeing more mercury in the livers of fish that are traveling in our area as well. And biologists call this biomagnification, meaning that these fish don't have the means to get rid of mercury. And now studies are showing us there are 50 tons of mercury locked away in the Arctic permafrost, pan-Arctic. And mercury is not just toxic, it is highly toxic. And when our permafrost is letting go, it lets go of methane, which is 300 times, about 200 times more heat retentive than carbon. So there are things that we can do through regulatory advocacy in oil and gas projects and natural gas projects in methane. Because methane, and us stopping it now, we will see those effect in 5 years. Whereas with carbon, that's even a century out. So I think in a lot of what I had learned, you come up against a lot of ignorance, and not even just as an Indigenous person, but the younger generations, you can be not necessarily scoffed at, but not listened to because of your age. There is a large and a rigid contingency in worldview, because that's what we're really doing here. And I'd like to share something with you that I can use for an example. One of the ministers of Indian Affairs in Canada, Bernard Belcourt, quite publicly in 2012, he met with our Grand Chief from the Yukon, Ruth Massey, and to her face told her, "We do not see you as government." When the Canadian government signed the umbrella final agreement in Canada, allowing within Canada's legislative framework self-governing agreements in the Yukon, and we had the Minister of Indigenous Affairs look our Grand Chief in the eye and say, "You're not a government." Wasn't even aware of the own documents their government had signed and he was a representative of. And I'll tell you, I can't do much about the Bernard Belcourts in the world. I can hold them accountable, but I'm not going to change them. It's Bernard's children, the real estate in his children's minds, that are the most valuable commodity on the planet today. And throughout all of our work, and whether this be legislative work, whether this be political, community, within our neighborhoods, and I've been into the international panels, and I've now seen in my last words is what I can share from my community is that I believe the solution to climate change now is community. We cannot give our power up to international negotiators. You cannot give all of your power to the prime minister or political representatives or the upper echelons of CEOs. They're part of the equation, they are, but your power is what's key, and our power as communities, because for a nation that's leading climate change action in the country, it's not me who's doing this of my own volition. It's my people that are holding me accountable. And this comes from the kitchen table discussions my people are having because of the changes that we are seeing on the land now. It is my people that are driving me to drive our nation, which has now become a leader around the world. It begins and it ends with community. And for that, and us as individuals, it only requires of us coming together. So for us coming together today and with the panelists, I really appreciate this opportunity. And I hope that I respected my elders' teachings by at least leaving you in this conversation that much more empowered. Masicho.
Thank you, Chief Tizya-Tramm. That was wonderful. I think I speak for all of us when I say that was wonderful. All right, the next speaker is Jojo.
Hi there, and wow, how do you follow that? And I think perhaps the answer in the context of this conversation is you follow it by offering up a tool that can help. And we believe very much that that is exactly what this movement is doing in terms of moving forward, putting in place an outer boundary, a sort of limit, an outer parameter for what is permissible, so that there is actually a point beyond which it is not okay to go. And it's funny, as this movement becomes more and more visible and more establishment figures are starting to pay attention to this, we sometimes get told, you know, you're mixing things up a bit. You know, why don't you keep the law for the lawyers and the policy for the policymakers, and, you know, the campaigning for the grassroots? And actually what we've just heard is an absolutely brilliant exposition of why the exact opposite is what we should be doing, and indeed why this movement is growing so fast, precisely because we are making as many connections as we can between the different sectors of society, between different cultures, taking inspiration from Indigenous leaders, and cross-feeding that with those people at the highest level who are making those decisions, and who, interestingly, this law will precisely hold accountable. So that those heads of state, those CEOs, those people in those upper echelons will not be able to act with impunity, because when something is designated at the international level within the paradigm that currently, rightly or wrongly, often wrongly, dominates the globe at present, that is a very, very strong message that is then given to society as a whole. When you make destruction of nature, i.e. ecocide, an international crime alongside genocide, what you are saying effectively is that destroying and damaging the living world around us is as important, as serious, as dangerous as it is to destroy people. And that makes a huge difference, because the dominant Western paradigm has been so alienated and so separated from the world around us for so long that the current situation in which, you know, our economic activities are almost in and of themselves ecocidal, certainly at their worst extremes, it's almost, you know, it's actually difficult to point a finger at individual companies or people about this, because it's actually the logical conclusion of, you know, an incredibly long-standing approach. And I think that Chief Tizya-Tramm really hit on that when he was talking about how, you know, it's not the steel, the steam, and the rubber in and of themselves. It's the intent with which those things are interacted with in the world. And I think that one of the things that Western culture educates out of us is that sense of empowerment, that sense of agency, that sense that we can actually have an effect on the world, and we can interact with the structures of the world in a positive way. And, you know, there are some perhaps more elite forms of education in the Western Canada that, you know, teach a certain small group a level of empowerment, but it's done against a sort of an idea of success that is generally based on material wealth and temporal power. Whereas if we actually all had that awareness that we have that agency, then it's actually incredible what we can achieve. And that was just such an extraordinary and brilliant expose and demonstration of how that works. And I think that one of the other aspects of criminalizing serious harm to nature is that there is this kind of echo in that of a really sort of deep and kind of almost existential reality of the kind of reciprocity that exists between all elements on this earth, because the reality is, when we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That is a fact, and we're seeing it playing out in ever more apocalyptic ways, as we've just heard described. And that is not something we make up in our heads, but it's something that's not yet reflected as a foundational piece in our legal system. And it will, I can't help but be completely convinced that it will make a really fundamental difference if that system actually begins to reflect that. And that is precisely, you know, that is one of the key impetus, if you like, behind this work to make ecocide an international crime. And Chief Tizya-Tramm also spoke about the IPCC report that came out recently, and how this is showing that, you know, in every area of life we need to be shifting, and yet there's this frustration with these international agreements where, you know, the direction in which we should be sprinting is one in which we're just crawling at the moment. And I think what we have to also acknowledge here is that there is a kind of natural inertia in the system whereby, you know, industry and, you know, the policymakers, you know, there's a tendency to continue with business as usual unless either external circumstances force a change, and, you know, heaven forfend that we actually get to the point where it really is an external forcing change, or that the legal requirement is to change. And that can't happen by improving regulation. You improve regulation, you change the budgeting in a corporation. But when you bring in criminal responsibility for individuals at the highest level, you actually start to change behavior. Not only that, but you start to create a framework within which all the decisions are made. And then everything gets easier. You know, these agreements are talking about having to tackle all of these different things at once. Yes, they all need tackling at once. But if we can set the ground rules by which they can be approached, then at least we know that whatever decisions are going to get made are not going to severely threaten the natural world around us. And that is an absolutely core parameter that doesn't yet exist and that needs to. And that really, for me, is where, you know, these two aspects, if you like, the legal aspect and the community aspect kind of interact in a kind of empowering, in an empowering way. And I'll leave it there because I think I'm probably going to run over my time, but it's just such a privilege to be on this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jojo, for that. All right, our third speaker, Aishwarya, do you want to take the stage?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, before I get started, I'd just like to let you know that I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral Peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario, and this land is situated within the Haldeman Treaty Tract. Also, before I start, I apologize if my voice wavers here and there. I'm not feeling too well, so it is what it is. All right, let's get started. Today, I'll be sharing my story, the work I do within the climate movement, and how my identity and cultural connections has taught me how to further navigate and improve youth organizing spaces. So I come from the lands of what the world calls the Deccan Plateau, beautiful land masses raised high above the ground, displaying millennia's worth of history in the forms of architecture and agriculture. And those land masses encompass the two villages, hundreds of kilometers apart, in southern India, where my parents grew up and where my ancestors resided. Now, all of my ancestors were farmers, except my grandfather, who broke the cycle to meet the necessities of his household. My family immigrated to Canada when I was 4 years old, and we did move out once, but we came back. Growing up, I'd hear stories of how my mom used to create plates out of dried leaves with my grandmother and sell them. It's her favorite story. I've heard it a million times. Now, every time I'd go to India, I'd be surprised of the little things my grandparents and my family would do, such as use cloth bags or sacks for groceries. And I think that, gosh, they're already eco-friendly. And yeah, I quickly learned that this was their way of life. And it's the same for so many other racialized communities. And perhaps this was where my true story started, but there was a distinct memory that changed everything. And this was when I was on my way to school in 8th grade. I lived in Saudi Arabia at the time. And I remember seeing a ridiculous number of plastic bottles and waste on the sides of roads amongst trees. And I reached school, and around the end of the day, we were handed lollipops, because obviously that's what middle school kids love. And my classroom was on the 3rd floor of the building, and the children immediately began throwing out the leftover lollipop sticks out the window, despite my pleas. I did manage to get a few of those lollipop sticks into the trash, though. And as we were leaving the building, I remember seeing this South Asian man sweeping the sidewalk, and specifically those lollipops that those children threw out. In Saudi Arabia, South Asian people and Filipinos make up a majority of the labor force. And so I remember looking at that and thinking, what's happening is just wrong. And I didn't know how to express that in words. And I didn't understand either. Now, a lot of people may think that that's because I was a kid, but it's wrong, because my sister, who's in 7th grade now, a year younger than I was at the time, knows exactly how to express those feelings. And so does the 6th grader that I worked alongside a campaign in 2020. But what was the difference? The difference was education, specifically climate education. When I look back that day on that incident, it's a metaphor for the crisis that we live in. people disconnected and uneducated about our environment, our system allowing such atrocities to happen. Although obviously that was a small thing, but it's a metaphor for the bigger world. And the people who are disproportionately impacted by what's happening in our world. And so after that whole 8th grade incident, I ended up learning about the climate crisis on my own through the internet. I joined the climate movement out of fear. And this was fear for our planet, fear for my family back in India, which is one of the most affected areas by the climate crisis, and fear for myself in the future, because I wanted the coming generations to discover the beauty of nature and connect. And unfortunately, this is a feeling a lot of youth join the climate movement for. We feel helpless a lot of the time, but I believe that the best way to tackle this feeling is through education. And that means education at a very, very young level. Currently, I'm a project manager with Teach the Teacher. We're a campaign aiming to get students to go into their own schools and present a presentation and start the discussion about climate change with their teachers. As project managers, we also present to school boards. Recently, we got to present to the Ottawa Carleton Elementary Teachers Federation as well. And our presentations focus on the disproportionate effects of the climate crisis, how it affects certain groups of people more than others, a bit of climate science, climate justice, intersectionality, eco-anxiety among children, and how teachers can deal with it, and how to incorporate climate education within their classrooms and lessons. And specifically for Canada, we also talk about including Indigenous teachings with regards to nature within their lessons. And furthermore, we provide them resources to take away that they can use. So far, we've reached around 21 countries across the world, and we've also gotten to COP26 and arranged the Education Ministers Summit along with many other partners. Now, my most surprising outcome throughout my time as an organizer working on climate education is how willing young children are to learn and furthermore take action. We underestimate them. These young individuals are our future, and giving them a chance to create change at such a young age shows them that they have that power within them. Climate education is currently a privilege when it should be a necessity. Now, while Teach the Teacher focuses on students of all ages, another campaign that I worked on called Banking on a Better Future focuses on high school and university students. So Banking on a Better Future is a campaign trying to get the big 5 banks of Canada, so BMO, RBC, TD, CIBC, and Scotiabank, to divest from fossil fuels. Collectively, these 5 banks together, since the 2016 Paris Agreement, have invested $700 billion into fossil fuel plans and projects. In fact, we have an action coming up this Friday targeting RBC and its investments in the Coastal GasLink pipeline that goes through Wet'suwet'en territory without their consent, furthermore ruining their land. I work as the education and outreach lead with this organization, and we're currently developing a curriculum for several different high school courses to incorporate financing of fossil fuels and investments into what students are learning. We also go to high school eco clubs and conduct presentations around financial literacy, banks and their investment, and where that money is going. We also provide alternatives such as credit unions. And now, obviously, not everyone has that power or autonomy over their own money to switch, and there are a lot of barriers within that. And so this is where accessibility, inclusivity, and understanding of others really comes into play within the movement, and which is incredibly important to further strengthen the movement. Where as I got more involved within the climate movement, I realized that not everyone agrees with me, right? And not everyone is going to have something good to say. And as a teenager, I'd see comments on the internet, people saying mean things, and I'd think, I'd be upset. And then I realized, why do I have to be upset? Why couldn't this be an opportunity for me to further strengthen what I'm trying to say, right? To further persuade, or to further maybe even listen to what they're saying and say, okay, this is what you're saying. Here's what I have to say. Can we come to a middle ground? Can we reach a state where maybe I persuade you, or can we listen each other out? And through that perspective is what really allowed me to understand conflict resolution and further implement it within an organization I work with. And it is, I think, something that is incredibly important and something that we need to implement within movements across the world. Now, before I was working on conflict resolution at that organization, which is Fridays for Future Digital, I was working on several international campaigns with Fridays for Future Digital. And we supported several land defenders from all over the world. And during that time, in the fall of 2020, my city in India was flooded, and it was severely flooded. Hundreds died, unfortunately, and it shook me to the core, because any of those lives could have been my family. In fact, one of my far relatives did lose his life, unfortunately, during those floods. Now, my grandma cannot evacuate. She uses a walker. Where's she going to go? None of my family owns private jets or properties in other parts of the country or the world. Where are they going to go? And so when I saw those pictures, I remembered a sentence that my incredibly inspiring friend, Ina Maria Chikongo, told me. What happens in the Kavango doesn't stay in the Kavango. To give context to what she said, the Kavango region is a region situated in Namibia, Botswana, and Angola. And currently Recon Africa, which is a Canadian-based oil company, is trying to frack there for oil. Now, if they do continue with their fracking, the amount of oil that will be produced from their project will unfortunately take up 1/6 of the remaining world's carbon budget. That project is a ticking carbon bomb. And what Ina was talking about was that whatever happens in her land, on her land, is not going to just affect her people. And it's not just going to affect the people in that region, but it's going to affect everyone outside of that region. And it's the same with any other natural disaster. And it's the same with any other environmentally destructive project, any other ecocide across the world. Whatever happens never stays in that region. Everything has a consequence and everything has a ripple effect, just like any other disaster. Now, at the start of what I was saying, I introduced by saying that I joined the climate movement out of fear. But where I am right now within the climate movement, I feel an overwhelming sense of hope. And I feel hope because of what Chief said. And that's what I was going to end with as well. I feel hope because of community. And it's this community that has strengthened me and empowered me. And it's with this community that I think that we truly can make a better world, and that we truly can connect with nature once again, and that we truly can live in harmony once again. And it's because of people like all the wonderful speakers here today and all of the wonderful people here today listening in. And with that, I end my little speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aishwarya. That was fabulous. Much appreciated. All right. Well, before I hand it over to our last panelist, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll get to the Q&A after Lisa speaks. And Lisa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm really grateful for the chance to join in the conversation with such a diverse panel. I get to speak to the role to legal issues, which just make people kind of nod off, but I'm going to weave in, I think, some of the perspectives that have been shared already, because they really do, relate, I think, really well. So I have just three points that I wanted to make in my remarks. And the first relates to the sort of general issue of the role of the law in the protection of the environment, particularly, I think, in an era where climate science is where it is now, so clear. And in starting, I really am thinking of the youth that are demonstrating such incredible leadership, like Aishwarya was just demonstrating. So I thought I'd start by taking us to Australia and discussing one recent case called the Sharma Case that some of you might have heard of. So this was a legal action that was brought by a group of children in Australia against the Federal Minister for the Environment. When I say that, I'm kind of really struck by what an incredibly brave, courageous, forward-looking action to take on the part of this group of children in relation to a proposed major coal mine expansion. And as this group of children was alarmed at the potential for serious long-term environmental harm, they argued that in deciding whether to approve this coal mine expansion under the Environment Protection Act in Australia, the minister had a duty to protect young people from the devastating impacts of climate change. And in the decision last May, the federal court judge agreed that the minister did have a duty of care. It's a pretty remarkable decision for a number of reasons, including that the judge relied on very specific detailed climate science to arrive at his factual findings. And I wanted to read part of that decision just to give you a sense of what I'm referring to. So having considered the facts that this group of children put forward, the judge said, and I quote, "It is difficult to characterize in a single phrase the devastation that the plausible evidence presented in this proceeding forecasts for the children. As Australian adults know their country, Australia will be lost, and the world as we know it gone as well. The physical environment will be harsher, far more extreme, and devastatingly brutal when angry. As for the human experience, quality of life, opportunities to partake in nature's treasures, the capacity to grow and prosper, all will be greatly diminished. Lives will be cut short. Trauma will be far more common, and good health harder to hold and maintain. None of this will be the fault of nature itself. It will be largely inflicted by the inaction of this generation of adults in what might fairly be described as the greatest intergenerational injustice ever inflicted by one generation of humans upon the next." And I end the quote. That passage really struck me. And the judge went on from there to discuss the foreseeability of the harm in finding that the minister did owe a duty of care. However, and there's a spoiler alert, on appeal by the government, last week, the full federal court in Australia overturned that decision. And in its reasoning, the federal court upheld the factual findings. So there was no dispute as to the existential threat of the climate crisis as just described in that passage. But the federal court held that to the extent there is a duty, it's a political duty, not a legal duty. So we could spend all day discussing the specifics of this case because lawyers love doing that. And it's possible that this could still be appealed to the High Court. I raise it partly because this case has caused some to question whether the law can even be an effective tool in addressing the serious threats related to the climate and biodiversity crises. But there's one commentator that I was struck by something that he wrote in The Guardian just this week. So I wanted to pull that out. He says, "In the ultimate analysis, what is the point of our law, if not to protect Australians from the most significant existential risk ever faced? What is the point of our constitution if Australia becomes all but uninhabitable, a land of fire, flood, and drought?" And I end the quote there. So I think there are obvious parallels when it comes to our conversations about the role of the law in relation to ecocide. And we know that international criminal law has an important role to play in protecting against serious harm and in ensuring accountability. I mean, that's what it's there to do. But we need for the law to catch up with the science. And I think we need it to help transform our relationship with the natural world and maybe reset the intent that Chief Tizya-Tramm referred to. And recognition of ecocide as a crime under international law, I think, is one critically important opportunity that we have to make that happen. This brings me to my second point, which relates to the interlinkages between the environment and human rights. and the calls for greater accountability for harms to both. And I think this also speaks to the engagement and the agency that others were just talking about. We know, states have made important commitments to the environment, and there's a whole network of legal and political commitments they've made to the environment. But the inadequacies of that global environmental governance are widely acknowledged, and it's pretty clear that there's a real problem when it comes to compliance and enforcement. And I heard the UN Special Rapporteur David Boyd recently refer to this as the Achilles heel of environmental law. And here's where human rights law has stepped in to sort of help fill a gap. So in recent years, the international human rights system, national human rights institution, courts at national and regional level, they've all helped to kind of help us deepen the appreciation of the linkages between the two. They've helped clarify obligations and responsibilities of states and corporate actors, and they've helped to a limited extent in holding states and corporations to account for their actions or inactions. Just to highlight one example, just this past October, after years of dedicated work by environmental defenders, Indigenous peoples, human rights activists, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a landmark resolution which recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And in doing that, the Council acknowledges that environmental degradation, climate change, and unsustainable development are among the most serious threats to the human rights of present and future generations. And it's really, this is the first time that I can recall where the rights of future generations is really becoming something that we talk about. And I think that we would be wise to follow the teachings of Indigenous peoples that have long talked about, the concept of 7 generations and future generations. And when it comes to our relationships with the land. This resolution, though, also I think is important because it highlights the grossly disproportionate impacts of environmental damage. And we know this vicious cycle that exacerbates climate injustices, which is that the people who contribute least to the problem suffer its worst consequences. More generally, though, too, that courts have increasingly been called upon to address the human rights consequences of the climate crisis, as affected individuals and groups have sought to hold governments and corporations to account. And the numbers of these cases has just skyrocketed, an increasing proportion of them too being brought by young people on behalf of future generations. So I think the Sharma case in Australia stands apart from a developing body of case law, as courts have demonstrated an increasing willingness to hold corporations and governments to account. Business entities too, we know, have called for greater accountability in relation to both human rights and the environment, including calling for individual criminal responsibility for the crime of ecocide. And there are large investment funds that are leaning on firms to change the way they do business. I'm grateful for the work of Aishwarya and other youth for the work that you're doing. And for example, there are funds requiring companies to provide more detailed explanations, be very concrete in how they intend to meet environmental and human rights goals. So the trend towards community and activist-led litigation in this area, the demands from some businesses and the increasing engagement of human rights to protect against environmental harm, I think also points to something much deeper, and that is a demand for more ambitious policy responses, as well as greater accountability under the law. Which brings me to my third and last point, which is that recognition of an enforceable international criminal law against ecocide responds to these calls. And I think it's a natural progression. And you kind of arrive at this from whatever angle you take, I think. The creation of an international crime of ecocide, it would bring concern for the environment into a system of law that's primarily been concerned with the protection of human life and dignity. It would acknowledge the scientific evidence and I think validate the work of the IPCC, It would introduce individual accountability at an international level for extreme environmental damage, in the same way that individual responsibility for gross human rights violations was created by the earlier body of international criminal law that this will fit into. It would align with corporate and investor-driven demands for greater human rights and environmental accountability, and it would push states to take legislative action at domestic level. And in doing that, it would help level the playing field for business, which is something we've heard, and which Jojo often has referred to as well. In the words of the ICC statute, international criminal law deals with unimaginable atrocities that deeply shock the conscience of humanity and which threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. And I think that adding ecocide to the list of crimes under the ICC statute would recognize that extreme environmental damage is of the same order, and I think help us sort of reset this question of intent that was spoken to at the beginning of our conversation. I think if we consider the code red for humanity that's reflected in the most recent IPCC reports, it's pretty clear that the need for action is more urgent now than ever. So I hope we can continue taking not just the discussions forward, but actually move to getting this placed before the ICC member states soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay, we'll move into the Q&A portion of the talk tonight. And I want to use my powers as host here to ask the first question. And I think this is something that resonated with everyone on the panel. You all mentioned it. Chief Tizya-Tramm talked about a change in intent. And correct me if I'm wrong, the way I heard that is, changing the way that we think about the earth, moving away from this idea of nature as a resource and towards thinking about humanity as being interconnected with nature. And, I've reported on some other places in the world, a lot of countries in South America who are incorporating this idea into their laws, whether it's their constitutions or legislation. And my question is, that was a big wind up to my question, is what do you all, whoever wants to jump in, what has kept countries like the United States, Canada, the UK from embracing this idea into their legal systems? Chief Tizya-Tramm.
Masi Cho, this is a loaded question and one that peels back, in my opinion, all the way to the departure from paganism into monotheism. A lot of European cultures actually began as very female orientated and community orientated, even up until the third dynasty in Egypt. It was the queen whom she married who became Amun-Ra. And it wasn't until that third dynasty that the king, if you will, declared himself Amun-Ra. And the reason why I bring this up is that, for instance, in our culture, we recognize that creator has chosen women to be the co-creator, not man. So there's a lot of sacred duty and function towards that. There's a Navajo saying that when the hearts of our women are on the ground, the nation is defeated. We recognize women as a centerpiece in their natural power in communities and in family units and all of the rest. So the reason why I bring this up, and a lot of this machinations and these philosophies around domination came with monotheism, were born through mechanized philosophies of Descartes, Galileo, Newton, and metabolized and were strengthened by the Industrial Revolution to homogenize. And what this is really about, and why the UK, United States, and Canada will probably be the first among them, is because of profits. And it's because of the gross domestic product. And please show me the study that has a correlation with happiness and the amount of money that you have. And I think this is where I was going with intent, because our money is based off of third-party banking cartels in what are called bonds that are written, that our money is printed off of as a debt system. that is supposed to correlate as reserve notes and for our GDP. But the GDP, I mean, our money could be based off of the health and the wellness of a family unit. And the tool is still there, but it fundamentally changes what this tool is doing. And I think that's where I'm speaking about intent. So when you look at, and I'm sorry, I do have to touch upon it, but you know, in World War II, when the UK and had really lost their geopolitical power, they used a 17th century arcane law to create offshore reserve banks, where a lot of the money, I mean, we just had there was the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers that just recently came out exposing a lot of the subversive underground money systems. And at the end of the day, it's no conspiracy theory. It's just follow the money in everything. And so until it really makes monetary sense to do so, that's when you're going to see that happen. And I'm sorry, but it will, to shape the monetary is really around what we've been speaking about today. And take it from me, someone who has witnessed attempted ecocide of the 64,000 square kilometers that is the Peel watershed, someone who has witnessed ecocide front row to the porcupine caribou herd. The regular order of business of modern society is ecocide. We need these laws to make it so that nature can be realized. Because as Yuval Noah Harari writes, you can dissect a human cell and you will not find a declaration for human rights. And what he means there is there is human law, but then there's the law of creator, the law of nature, and what is allowed to happen. And it's about time that our human personal truths were informed by the objective truth of nature. So what's holding back the UK, the United States, and Canada is, first of all, they don't have an imagination. They can't imagine their way out of capitalism. And studies show that the average person on Earth can easily imagine the end of the world through climate change. They have a difficulty imagining a system outside of capitalism. That's where our problem lies. And the answer, again, for me, shamelessly, I'll re-say it, it goes back to community. Masi.
Thank you. I want to leave it open if anyone wants to comment or add anything to that. And I can move on to the next question. Thank you for that. This one is for Jojo, and wondering if you could update everyone on what is going on with the Stop Ecocide campaign right now. Where are things at this moment?
Sure, with pleasure. I'll try and be concise. So we had two very key milestones last year. Firstly, the launch of the legal definition that was a consensus definition reached by a panel of 12 lawyers from around the world. And that launched in June last year. And it's really made a huge difference. The definition itself was very short, fits on the back of a business card. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And it's been very well received in the political world. The momentum around this movement has grown hugely since that definition emerged. Just within the first week, we had 100 publications around the world, major publications talking about it. And we're now in a situation where at least 20 of the International Criminal Court's member states have had or are having discussions around ecocide law at parliamentary and/or government level. And that's a really huge progress. The second milestone was actually the presentation of that definition to the context it was intended for at the Assembly of State Parties of the International Criminal Court in December. And that was supported by 3 of the most climate vulnerable states in the world, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Bangladesh. And we had an impromptu diplomatic intervention from Belgium as well, which is a front runner in this conversation. Indeed, just before Christmas, the Belgian parliament overwhelmingly voted to demand that their government legislate for ecocide and support an international crime of ecocide. And so this conversation is very firmly on the table at the International Criminal Court. A formal proposal has not yet been made, but it's not outside the bounds of possibility that could happen as early as this year. That's certainly what we would like to encourage, help, facilitate, and so on. And in the meantime, what we're also doing is mobilizing at different levels, both the grassroots level and the kind of diplomatic level. So just this week at the grassroots level, there's a Europe-wide, in fact, global mobilization around Ecocide to support the European Crime Directive discussions, and in the hope of actually including Ecocide into those discussions. And then at the diplomatic level, we're also aiming to insert language around Ecocide into key UN documents that are being discussed at different events and conferences. And already in the UN Environment Assembly, we've seen that surfacing, both in the closing and opening speeches of the UNEP president and the leader of UNEP, Inga Anderson, but also very strongly from the Youth Environment Assembly as well. The youth voice is growing louder and louder in this movement, and that's really making a huge difference. The Swedish government just recently acknowledged youth groups demanding that the conference in June in Stockholm must focus on Ecocide. So those are the kind of threads that we're pulling together and moving forward this year, and it's very exciting. Thanks for asking. Oh, and one last thing, hot off the press, just this week, in Iceland, a resolution similar to Belgium was put forward in the Icelandic parliament, also demanding national and international legislation for Ecocide. And that was cross-party support, including the party of the Prime Minister. So we're very much looking forward to seeing what happens with that resolution.
Terrific. Aishwarya, I have a question for you. Wondering what advice you have for other young people, or old people for that matter, who want to become involved in their communities, either as environmental defenders or in another way. What would you say to them?
Honestly, first of all, I'd say that there is no right way to be an environmental defender, to be an environmental activist, or to be someone who cares about the environment, right? It's about finding your niche. What do you like to do, right? For me, I love teaching. I love speaking to young children. I love sharing knowledge and learning knowledge, and I love listening to one another. And so that's where I found my niche, and that's why a lot of my climate activism focuses on climate education. And so for you, let's say you love art. Well, there's an entire art community within the climate movement, and to find it, all you need is a simple Google search. In this day and age where internet is everywhere, it's really that simple. And let's say you don't have access, let's assume, then you can go to your town hall. You can go and ask people, hey, do you know of any environmental group? Or if there is no environmental group, like at my high school, my old high school, I recently moved, but at my old high school, there was no environmental group. And so I was in grade 9, back to Canada, all new, but I decided to start one. And so with starting that, we gained an entire community within that school. And obviously it's something really small, but it makes a huge impact because it grows, it strengthens, and you reach beyond just that small community that you've started it up with, right? You reach people beyond that. And so, yeah, it's all about finding where you think you'll fit in, where you think you'll be able to genuinely help the movement, and where you think you can give your best towards.
Thank you. Thank you. And a last question I want to get in for Lisa. I keep saying international law is having a moment right now, not for the best reasons, but it's having a moment. And for people in Canada who maybe aren't familiar with the International Criminal Court, could you say a little bit about what Canada's relationship is with the court? Is it a member? Has it supported Ecocide? If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. And I think international law is having a moment. Just a personal reflection. I have a close friend who's been directly involved in working with Jojo at a much earlier stage before I joined. And when I was looking at, how can I engage? I feel, I'm obsessed with this issue of climate accountability, but my background is in human rights. And so through conversations, particularly with her, when I realized what she was involved in and what she was a part of, I remember writing to her and just saying, I haven't actually felt this excited about international law in a long time, because I think this is a really critically important movement and a really critically important opportunity to make the law relevant in helping communities and helping us sort of reset our relationship and address this crisis. But just to come back to your question about Canada, Canada was a leader in establishing the International Criminal Court, and I think kind of visionary at the time. Canada played a lead role in the establishment of the Rome Statute, which is the founding treaty of the International Criminal Court, and was one of the first to implement the domestic legislation that states that ratify the treaty are required to do. So really, Canada in the late 90s and early 2000s was at the forefront and has continued to be a great supporter of the International Criminal Court and its work. I think it's worth noting 2 points, just reflecting on Canada in relation to the crime of ecocide. I mean, ecocide is, as an international crime, is not a new concept, as we know. It was, contemplated many, many years ago. It was discussed prior to the adoption of the Rome Statute, and no doubt Canada would have been involved in those discussions in some shape or another. But the time back in the 90s was not right for its inclusion in the way that it clearly is now. And the second thing is that serious damage to the environment is already included in the Rome Statute of the ICC. But it's only in times of armed conflict. So it's considered a war crime in times of armed conflict. And the proposed ecocide crime would sort of widen that scope and include serious damage also outside of armed conflict, which it obviously needs to do. So again, I think that, Canada, having played such a role in the development of the Rome Statute, would have been involved in developing that war crime. So I don't think a new concept for Canada. Having said that, Canada so far has, we know, followed the discussions closely and has been engaged in that sense, but is not among the leading states to speak up and really be positively engaged. But we're hopeful, and I think Canada has an opportunity now to step back into that leadership role that it has shown in the past.
Thank you. We are a bit over. I'm going to pass it back to Emily at Stop Ecocide Canada. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. Wonderful to hear you all speak. Lovely to be here and be a part of this. And Emily, I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, and a huge thank you to you, Katie. This was absolutely fantastic. Your questions were so insightful, and a massive thank you to our panelists. I learned so much from what you said, and I know that everybody here enjoyed this so much. So thank you so much for the time you gave to participate in this webinar. Many people here know that this is the International Week for the Criminalization of Ecocide, and today is the day of ecocides and land defenders. So this all culminates this Friday with the International Climate Strike, as well as the International Day for Ecocides and Fossil Fuels. I encourage everybody to just be following the news and contributing in whatever ways you have the capacity to do. But whatever way you can, please make sure to keep following this movement and all the ways in which you would like to defend nature and to support environmental advocacy. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. And with that, I will let you all go. Thanks again.